Well, joining us now for more on one of them is Jeff Mendelsohn. He is the executive director of the Pro-Israel America, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. And Jeff, thanks for joining us. Before we start getting to some specific issues, let me just ask you, now that the dust is settling a bit in Washington after the election, a general sense of the atmosphere there and your view on Israel policy as it's developing, both in the Biden administration and especially on Capitol Hill in Congress.
Well, thank you, Calev. It's great to be here with you this afternoon. The issues that you've raised, Iran, the ICC, others, are obviously very critical to the U.S.-Israel relationship, and Israel's security. The 117th Congress is filled with many champions of the U.S.-Israel relationship. We at Pro-Israel America, we're happy to endorse and help elect 70 of those members of the 117th Congress. And I remain very, very confident that this Congress will continue the bipartisan tradition of caring and watching out for Israel's security and well-being. That said, of course, we know there's a lot of partisanship in Washington, and we know there will be debates and disagreements on specific points of policy and tactics.
Right. Now, let's look at some of the issues. We mentioned this ICC, International Criminal Court probe of The Hague. Now, the Biden administration or senior officials have spoken out against that probe on some of the issues involved, whether, of course, the issue of jurisdiction. But there are voices in Congress, especially among some of the what might call the progressive Democratic wing, that have supported the ICC in general and even in this probe in specific. So how do you assess the attitudes there in Washington to this developing situation?
Yeah, the move by the International Criminal Court to exert jurisdiction here clearly exceeds its bounds. This is a politically motivated move that is one of it's just the latest of a long series of efforts to get international bodies that were created for very noble purposes to become tools to constrain Israel, to ostracize Israel, to undermine Israel's ability to defend itself. And this is just the latest example of that. The good news here is, as you mentioned, there's really broad consensus with the Biden administration and in Congress that this is absolutely beyond the pale. And I think you're going to see continued pushback. You're correct that there are voices. I know that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar immediately praised the decision of the ICC to exert to launch an investigation against Israel. That's not surprising, but fortunately, her voice is the minority voice in Congress. There's been the Vice President Harris, Secretary of State Tony Blinken have both stated very clearly that it's the position of the United States that this move is beyond the authority of the ICC. And that makes sense, of course, because this is not just about Israel, but it also implicates the United States, which has also been a target of ICC activity. And it implicates other American allies around the world, Western democracies and other countries around the world, for which this is not an appropriate move. In Congress itself, more than 50 senators have come together on a bipartisan basis, signing a letter that was spearheaded by Senators Rob Portman and Ben Cardin, stating that the ICC move was without authority and calling on the Biden administration to very, very forcefully push back against this decision, which it seems to be doing.
Right. Now, in contrast to the ICC issue, there are clear differences between Israel and the Biden administration when it comes to Iran, especially the Iran nuclear agreement. We don't yet actually know how deep those differences may run as the Biden administration sets its policies. What do you see going forward? How serious or not that rift could be? And also the mood in Congress. We do see Republican opposition already materializing against a return, certainly to the JCPOA as it was, with some, but definitely we have to say, limited Democratic support at this stage.
There's very, very broad agreement that Iran should not get a nuclear weapon. And I think that's really where we need to make the starting point. There is also growing agreement within Congress that any future negotiations must deal not only with the nuclear issue, which of course is a huge priority, but also must deal with Iran's other aggressive behavior in the region that is threatening stability, undermining peace, and putting at risk the national security of the United States, of Israel, and other American allies in the region, some of whom are fortunately now allies of Israel. So that's the starting point. Any diplomacy, from our viewpoint, needs to be tough diplomacy, backed by strong economic and diplomatic pressure to ensure that Iran never has the ability to obtain nuclear weapons and to curb Iran's ballistic missile program, to curb its support for terrorism and instability in the region, and to deal with its longstanding violation of human rights. There is a debate in Congress on this issue, as you mentioned. There's on both the right and the left, there are opinions. But from my perspective, the good news is that there is a consensus that exists, a bipartisan consensus that's growing in Congress. In a recent letter that was spearheaded by Congressman Anthony Brown and Michael Waltz, you had 140 members of Congress, 70 Democrats and 70 Republicans that came together to articulate that this is an issue that must be dealt with, that negotiations must be tough, that we need to extend any agreement long into the future to ensure that Iran never can get a nuclear weapon while dealing with these other issues that I mentioned, terrorism, ballistic missiles, and violations of human rights. Another letter was spearheaded by Congressman Josh Gottheimer and Michael McCall. Congressman McCall is the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and that was signed by 24 members of the House, 12 Democrats, and 12 Republicans. So you have basically 1/3 of the House of Representatives and roughly 1/3 of the Democratic caucus also that have already come together to express this bipartisan consensus. You have a new effort led by Senator Menendez, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, and Senator Lindsey Graham, also to pull together a bipartisan group of senators in the Senate to express this view, a similar viewpoint to the administration.
Jeff, we just have about a minute left, but I just want to ask you, I mean, is the atmosphere fundamentally different, say, from 2015 in terms of attitudes or even suspicions to Iran? Because in this kind of agreement, really, everybody or there may be consensus agreement not to allow Iran getting nuclear weapons, but the devil will be in the details of any agreement.
The devil's always in the details, Calev, as you know. I think there is a different mood. As the Secretary of State has said on numerous occasions, 2021 is not 2015, and I think there's that agreement in Congress that we need to look at this with fresh eyes in light of everything that's happened over the last 6 years. There are those, like I said, there are those who just want to get right back into the agreement, lift sanctions, and call it a day. That's in my view, in the view of Pro-Israel America, the wrong approach. It's just giving concessions with no results, and giving up bargaining chips just for the sake of bargaining. We can't have that. But I think there is a different mood in Congress, and to see this level of bipartisanship at this point in Congress after the events of January, I think is a very, very positive sign.
All right. Well, we'll see how far that goes as we start getting into the details of that formulation of the Biden administration's Iran policy. Jeff Mendelsohn, Executive Director of Pro-Israel America, thank you for joining us on the Rundown.
Thank you.